Neil with you this Thursday edition of 2020. Hey, a conversation coming over this next hour. I do want you to feel comfortable to call in, even if you've got a burning question. Might have been burning in your mind for many years. Maybe you've been through school, university, a lot of different areas of learning around issues to do with this creation versus evolution model that people love to debate. So there is a fascinating conversation coming over this next hour with a guest who is researching human genetics and other issues related to biblical creation. So we're going to be talking today about ancient DNA. Our special guest says biology today is so complex, if Charles Darwin saw it, he'd have a hard time being an evolutionist. Dr. Robert Carter navigated his own in-depth evolutionary training through years at university and emerged with his Christian faith intact. He has taught biology, chemistry, physics, and electronics. Before obtaining his PhD in marine biology, Dr. Robert Carter is a senior scientist and speaker for Creation Ministries International. He's based in the US. The office of CMI in the US is in Atlanta, Georgia. His latest DVD is entitled Ancient DNA, and I might say a very special welcome to the studio to you, Robert Carter.
Well, thank you.
Hey, Robert, you're in Australia. This is like a month-long tour, yes. I think, and I'll tell listeners how they can get in touch with you and be a part of some gatherings that you'll be speaking to in Cairns. But I wonder if we might start with Charles Darwin. So many people admire Charles Darwin, and clearly he was a thinking man of science. But as I mentioned in that introduction there, if Charles Darwin was alive today, would he be able to hold the same sorts of concepts? Give us your insight here.
It's really kind of funny because Darwin, being an 19th century gentleman, he knew as much about the science of the day as anyone could know, but they didn't know anything we know today. So evolutionary theory was invented in a vacuum of knowledge. He didn't know what genetics was. He didn't know how traits are passed from one generation to the next. He didn't know what mutations were. He didn't know all these things we know today about the wonders of the technology inside the cell and how complex life is. He depended upon life being simple for evolution to work, and life is not at all simple. So if he were alive today, I don't think he would be able to invent his very simplistic, natural selection can change things over a very long time and you get all these new things can develop, because he has to explain where things came from. And complexity doesn't come from random processes.
Because he didn't know all of these modern issues in science, and I can hear what you're saying, and our listeners will be able to appreciate, well, of course, he didn't know what modern science knows today, but was it enough for him to form a theory about evolution?
His hypothesis was that natural selection can lead to grand evolutionary changes. That's what the origin of species was. He promised that he was in the future going to come out with a lot more information to prove all this, to prove his hypothesis, but he never actually could do it because natural selection is not what he needed. Natural selection, all it does is remove things. It gets rid of the unfit. It prevents organisms from reproducing if they don't quite fit the environment very well. That's not a creative process. So he was really struggling a lot, even then, with explaining how so-called evolution could work. But in the biblical model, we have a genius creator God who created life to change and adapt because he's smart.
So what Charles Darwin was able to do was observe that there were some things that might change and form a theory of evolution, as you say, the survival of the fittest. The fittest survive and the weakest are either devoured or die out. But he didn't understand things that we might appreciate today about things like mutation and the way that would have affected different animal species.
Yeah, well, of course, the modern evolutionists, they use mutations. That's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, when they took natural selection plus mutation. Oh, now we can explain where everything comes from. But again, that doesn't explain the rise of complex structures. Once you have living things, they can change. Great. Our God created living things. Now they can change to some degree. So the question's not, can things change? The question's not, can mutations cause, a white bear, we call that a polar bear, or a black bear? That's irrelevant. The question is, where did the bears come from? And can a simple process of mutation plus natural selection create something as complex as what we see inside the cell?
And what you are saying is that modern science should tell us that those things can't happen.
Modern science is, if we apply all the rules of probability and chemistry and information theory to the cell, no, there's nothing out in the natural world that's going to produce a living thing, let alone a complex living thing.
And you say that Charles Darwin was working on a sequel to his book, Origin of the Species,
Yes.
but he couldn't complete it.
He couldn't complete it.
Why do you think he could not ever complete it?
Because he could not find the information that he needed. He said he was going to use 10 model organisms to show how natural selection works on them. And we found the manuscript, not me, but the manuscript was found in his study after he died. He completed multiple other books during that time, but the grand proof of evolution, according to natural selection, was not forthcoming because it wasn't there.
Robert, this is a fascinating conversation, and we're going to get into some great dimensions in our conversation today. But what is it that listeners might need to know about genetics, about the complexity of how things look today to a modern scientist, if we're going to understand a conversation about these genetics and mutations and those sorts of things?
Yeah, the conversation is not going to be, can things change? The conversation is, how complex is life? Because once life is too complex for simplistic Darwinian evolution to explain, then we have to look to an alternate source, and the alternate source is going to be the God of the Bible.
It's funny, isn't it? Because my suspicion is that the reputation that Christians have is that somehow or other we're the ones who are being simplistic. But it seems to be the opposite, because anyone who wants to ascribe to a Darwinian evolution, they're actually the ones who are ascribing to the simplistic. How complex is the design that we talk about when we start to appreciate a creator being involved?
How complex is the design, man. How many people in the listening audience have had a course in biology and struggled because there are so many words to learn? That's only the introduction. The deeper you go in biology, the more things there are to learn, and it never ends. There's so much complexity, so much amazing details, so much, feedback loops and all sorts of interactions of different cellular components, and nothing in the cell is independent of anything else. All the parts have to work together. It's like a system. God didn't create a living thing. He created systems within living things that all interact with each other and build on each other in order for life to work. It's this higher level complexity stuff that's hard for the human brain even to understand. That's what living things are. It's the opposite of the life is really simple and we can just change willy-nilly and natural selection can be applied and now you can have, butterflies evolve from caterpillars or something like that. No, these are hard things to overcome. And even at the most basic parts of the evolutionary tree, one of the first evolutionary organisms in their model to ever evolve was a blue-green alga. But they're photosynthetic. The earliest organisms that anyone can see in the evolutionary model, now I don't believe the evolutionary model, but in their model, are photosynthetic organisms. But photosynthesis is the most improbable set of chemical reactions that anyone could imagine. Those chemicals that are capturing the light beams, it's like a butterfly trying to capture a cannonball. Those photons from the light destroy the biological molecules. And so the biological molecule captures a photon and instantly hands it off to another one so it doesn't get destroyed. And that one hands it off to another one so it doesn't get destroyed. And each time they hand it off, they take a little bit of energy and they're able to make energy for the cell. But you're talking about thousands of genes, thousands of proteins, all in this very delicately balanced, elegant, sort sort of like a dance of molecules. And that's at the base of the tree of life. That's not simple. That's complex. So the complexity of life is what's arguing against Darwinian evolution. It always has.
The complexity, and coming back to this thought that Christians are the ones who are considered to be simplistic in our approach, saying God is the creator. But when you begin to describe that, and just this complexity of photosynthesis, as you just did, sometimes people will even make a reference to things like a simple cell.
Oh, yes, a simple cell.
Now, give us a little insight here, as someone who is a biologist, an expert in this field. How complex is that simple cell?
The simplest possible life form has to be able to maintain a difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, or life can't happen. So they need a membrane. They need pores in the membrane that can let ions in and out. This organism is going to have to take molecules and break them apart and harvest the energy. That's like trying to harvest energy out of a fire. How do you do that? Fires consume everything, but no, the organisms can take a sugar molecule, say, break it in half, take a little bit of energy and use that to do all these other cellular things, which is going to include at least hundreds of proteins that already have to be present, and all the systems have to be present. And that's even assuming it can get what it needs from the outside. But what warm little pond in Darwin's concept is going to have all the parts that the cell needs? And that cell's also going to have to be able to reproduce. Could you imagine if there was a factory with a bunch of robots that was designed to make another factory with a bunch of robots and in order to reproduce itself? I mean, how much complexity would be required? How many systems how much intelligent design would have to go into the development of that factory, and how much thought and how much money and how much technology just to build a simple factory that reproduces itself? Life is more complex even than that.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who are hoping that AI might get some level of science interactions to that sort of level. I like a terminology that you use if you're describing the complexity. You say that there is a spaghettification of irreducible complexity. You better explain that for us.
Well, Michael Behe and other people in the intelligent design community, they gave us the phrase specified complexity, which is, or irreducible complexity, I should say. This is, you have a thing like a mousetrap and only has a few parts, but each one has to be exactly right, or the mousetrap doesn't function. Well, life is a lot more complex than just that. So if you wanted to produce like, let's say the motor in our cells that produces energy, makes ATP. Well, that motor is based on proteins, but the proteins have to be coded in the DNA. And that DNA has to be maintained, which requires hundreds of other proteins just to maintain the DNA, which are also coded in the DNA. But a protein, from the DNA, it has to be transcribed into RNA, which requires a whole set of proteins and RNAs, and then that has to be made into the protein, but all those steps also require ATP. So in order to make the ATP motor, the thing that makes the ATP, you need thousands of other things that use up ATP to be produced. So what came first? The information for the ATP motor in the DNA, the ability to maintain the DNA, the ability to make the RNA, the ability to make the proteins, to modify the proteins, to assemble that motor to make the ATP. You're talking about, hundreds if not thousands of levels of using ATP in order to make ATP. So this is not something that's going to evolve. This is God putting all the components of a cell together, orchestrating them, putting them in the right place, putting exactly the right amount of nutrients and the right pH and all these things, and then letting go, and it works. Such a system doesn't arise from naturalistic, random processes.
So if you're in this debate, evolution versus creation, you're really in accidental versus intentional.
Yeah,
the design of a creator in the complexity is an absolute necessity. How do you describe that for people who are, no doubt you're talking to people all the time who are skeptics, and they want to be skeptics because they find it very hard to accept that there is a divine creator who created the heavens and the earth and people like us. How do you describe that? Is there a simple way of just being able to say, wait a minute, you're talking accidental, I'm talking intentional, and this is why I need to talk about intentional?
Yes, and this is why we love to talk about complexity. Because when you look at the complexity of the cell, it demands that an outside agent created the cell. Probability says it's not going to happen by itself. Chemistry says it's not going to happen by itself. We need a God who's outside of time and space in order to create life. He is an all-sufficient cause. He's also a necessary component of biology.
Well, our special guest is Dr. Robert Carter. He's a senior scientist and speaker for Creation Ministries International. He's based in the US. He's in Australia for a series of meetings throughout October. In fact, this weekend you can catch him, in fact, tomorrow night in Cairns at Cairns South Baptist Church. He's going to be at Destiny Church in Atherton on Saturday night, on Sunday at Cairns Family Church in Warree, and he's heading to Victoria next week, and you'll be able to see all of the dates of where he is speaking at the website creation.com, creation.com for all those tour dates. I want to open our talkback lines. You might have a question that you'd like to ask a creationist. You might be someone who's a long-time skeptic, a doubter of whether God is the creator. I want to invite you to call in, and it might be in this area of DNA, it might be about genetics, could be about any other issue too, and I'm sure Robert's very capable of being able to bring a great response. 1-800-316-316. We're back with more in just a few moments.